I'm, as you guessed, from Europe originally, so this is a subject very close to my heart for obvious reasons, considering what's happened over the past few years. So I've been spending a lot of the last few years going back and forth from here to Europe, talking to government officials from all over Europe about this issue. So I'm going to speak a little more broadly on the back of Todd's comments about how I see the situation in Europe at the moment and how we got here. So I live in one of those like pretty liberal DC neighborhoods where there's a lot of those signs you see up, those front yard signs which says everyone welcome here, refugees welcome, all that sort of stuff. The kind of like sign of inclusiveness and tolerance and all that. Whenever I see those, I kind of think Chancellor Merkel's asylum policy in 2014-15 is kind of like the DC yard slogan adopted to government. Because in 2014-15, there was millions of people fleeing from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, obviously humanitarian crises there, heading to Europe. There was also people coming from migration coming to Europe, especially Italy, from Africa. And the enormous flow of people was placing unsustainable pressure on landing ports in Greece and in Italy, threatening the territorial integrity of the Balkans. And Chancellor Merkel responded by opening Germany's borders, letting in a mix of obviously genuine asylum seekers, but also alongside some economic migrants, and as Todd has discussed, also those who are looking to infiltrate Europe for explicitly nefarious purposes. So over 1.5 million asylum seekers arrived in Germany between 2015 and 2018, almost 1 million in 2015 alone. It was essentially the open borders dream coming to fruition, really. Such were the numbers and so unprepared with the European border agencies, most people would just wave through with cursory or sometimes non-existent background checks. But Chancellor Merkel would soon discover that if you invite in the world, you also invite in the world's problems. And this has particular relevance, of course, to terrorism. I've done a lot of research in this area. I think my numbers show there's almost 1,000 people have been injured or killed in terrorist attacks in Europe, featuring asylum seekers or refugees since 2014, and that 16% of the overall plots Europe has faced in that time period have contained asylum seekers or refugees. Todd already referred to the Paris November 2015 attack, which was the most prominent example of the exploitation of migrant routes. But I think one of the most striking examples to me is Germany. So in Germany, there were only 11 plots disrupted between 2000 and 2013. Not a single terrorist atrocity took place in that time. After the migration crisis, the threat spiked. You had terrorist attacks committed by asylum seekers in Berlin, in Ansbach, and Hamburg, and other places as well. There's also been this, and this has been very, very difficult for German authorities to know how to even discuss this. There has been high-profile but multiple rape murder cases of teenage girls in Germany that were committed by adult asylum seekers who claimed to be minors to get into the country. There was the mass sexual assaults you saw on New Year's Eve of 2015. These are obviously really, really rare cases, exceedingly rare cases, but they're high profile, they make a splash, and they have been of significant concern to the general public in Germany. Then you can look at a place like Sweden. So Sweden took in 163,000 asylum seekers in 2015. As a percentage of their overall population, that's like you guys taking in 5.2 million people in a single year and expecting everyone to integrate seamlessly. Gang violence in Sweden, it's an unfortunate fact, largely emanates from immigrant communities. There's been a sharp rise in firearms murders in the country. The statistics they have on sexual assaults show they're being committed disproportionately by those with an immigrant background. And one recent study showed that more than 75% of asylum seekers in Sweden claiming to be children were actually adults. Austria, Italy, and others in Europe are facing similar challenges on this. So how has Europe responded? It's not ignored the problem altogether. The numbers have dropped year on year since 2015. 185,000 people arrived to Germany in 2018, which is still over 15,000 a month, but is obviously less than the almost 1 million that arrived in 2015. When you look at the causes behind the drop, the EU has tripled funding for border management and migration issues, but I tend to think the more pertinent reason is that in March 2016, the EU signed an agreement with Turkey in which Erdogan was promised 6 billion euros in financial aid to be used by the Turkish government specifically to finance projects for Syrian refugees. Let's be honest about what it was. It was essentially a bribe from the European Union to try and keep Syria's problems in Turkey rather than more in Europe than they already were. The issue of that, of course, with that is that Europe is essentially being held hostage to the whims of Turkish politics. Last month, Erdogan threatened to send every refugee being held in Turkey to Europe because there was criticism from Europe about Turkey's military incursion into Syria. Don't expect that to be the last time such a threat is made by Erdogan. So another option for Europe is the potential deportation of those who have no legal right to be in the country. Germany's had significant problems in this. One of the reasons with Germany is that deportation is not a task for the federal government, but one that falls to the individual states. So authorities in the south, in states such as Bavaria, tend to be a bit more conservative. They've taken a little bit of a tougher approach. In the more liberal north, in Berlin, for example, authorities have been more reluctant to pursue deportations. There's some judges who've been unwilling to approve things like bone x-rays, for example, in order to ascertain an asylum applicant's age, saying that it's discriminatory. The German Medical Association is still speaking out against checking claimants' ages during the asylum process. And these blockades to deportation mean that as a result, Germany has actually begun to pay asylum seekers to leave. It's offering funds as high as 3,000 euros in an attempt to lower the numbers overall. That problem isn't just confined to Germany. In January 2016, Sweden projected that up to 80,000 of their asylum applicants would be rejected. One official told me that even though that's true, probably about 50,000 of those will end up staying. And that's not a specifically post-2000. The scale is significant and different post-2015, but it's not just a post-2015 problem. The ability to deport those without identity papers or those fleeing from war zones or countries with bad human rights records has been an ongoing concern for European nations. The guy who carried out the attack in Stockholm in April 2017 was exactly one of these cases. He was from Uzbekistan. Sweden can't deport people to Uzbekistan because it does have a terrible human rights record. He eventually ended up going to ground. The authorities lost track of him, and he carried out his attack. Those kind of incidents, I think, help explain perhaps what is the most important response and one that we are still trying to figure out, I think, in Europe, how exactly to analyse this, but that's the response from the general public. In Germany, millions have turned to Alternative for Germany, AfD, got about 6 million votes in September 2017, an explicitly anti-immigration party. There's a rise in support for Le Pen in France. She got almost 11 million votes in spring 2017. The Swedish Democrats gaining strength in Sweden, and I think the migration surge certainly played in the role of the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, or its ongoing attempt to leave the European Union in the summer of 2016. And we see a similar picture elsewhere in Europe. So just some observations on today. migration to Europe is still obviously occurring from the Middle East, Africa, and other regions. The Balkans land route, which ends up in Germany or Austria, or via the route via the central Mediterranean, remain the most popular way of accessing Europe. With the central Mediterranean, there's optimism in Italy that the route via Libya is increasingly difficult to use as more parts of the border are being patrolled. That means that more popular alternatives to Italy are increasingly Spain and Greece. And we're also seeing travellers from West Africa using Morocco and Turkey as jumping off points for entry to Europe, as they don't need a visa to access those countries. And so how this is applicable to the US, as Todd says, the US has taken a more guarded approach to this than Europe. It's not immune to the problem. But there was a case recently where the FBI thwarted a plot by a Syrian refugee to bomb a Pittsburgh church in the name of ISIS. And I think you also see that one of the interesting things in Europe is that it's some of the more developed countries in Africa, for example, rather than extremely poor ones, that are seeing an increase in migrants to Europe because there is more cash to pay smugglers to try and get them out of the country. It's often impossible for truly impoverished countries to do the same, which I think has some applicability to the US migration question as well, with regards to Central America. So it's easy to talk. I'd wrap up by saying just, I guess, general thoughts on this. It's really easy for us all to talk about inclusion in society. It makes us feel good. It's not going to upset anyone, and it's easy to do. The tough conversations to have about exclusion. It's more unpalatable, of course it is, but it's equally important. America, like Europe, has a choice. Is it home for everyone who turns up and says it is? The concept of the nation state has proved itself to be the foundation for the most successful forms of governance ever created. Roger Scruton, the English philosopher, has said that the nation state is the largest extension of the first person plural you can do. It's the largest extension of we. And yet we see attempts, I think, at times to undermine this from people gambling that democracy can survive without any ability to decide who is included and who is excluded, and can survive with a diminished sense of national loyalty. I come back to my DC yard signs of everyone is welcome here, because not everyone can be welcome in a certain place if you want to retain a sense of national identity and control over borders. That's as true for America as it's true for every other single country in the world. And my hope would be that America doesn't have to learn some of those lessons in the same painful way that we in Europe have over the past few years. And with that, I will wrap up and pass on to Jim.